Space Shuttle Atlantis said, well, on the topic of Revelation, I haven't watched all your videos on 8070 theory yet, but what do you think? What was revealed to John in Revelation, and does it have any relevance to the destruction? Does it have any relevance to the destruction of Jerusalem? Yes, the book of Revelation has a great deal to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. Based on my study of the book of Revelation and of the New Testament, I believe that the New Testament was complete by about 8068 and disseminated throughout the church before AD 70. So that when the destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70, the church was very well informed about it. So, yeah, I do believe that the book of Revelation has a lot to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. However, I do not believe that the entirety of the book of Revelation, or the entirety of the New Testament for that matter, was fulfilled by the destruction of Jerusalem. And I would say that of New Testament prophecy, the only as yet unfulfilled New Testament prophecy is obviously the second coming of Christ. Obviously, the second coming of Christ hasn't happened yet because we're all still here. And the last thing that's going to happen is that this physical creation is going to be done away with. There's not going to be, it goes back to what we were just looking at, heaven and earth passing away. Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away. And in all of those uses of that phrase, heaven and earth, that we looked at, to the overwhelming majority of the use of that phrase, it's referring to the physical creation. Okay. And again, I believe that Jesus is using it here, just like Moses used it, as a witness of certainty to what he said. Okay. So we're told explicitly in the New Testament that this creation will come to an end. It will be destroyed. And so I know that the second coming of Christ hasn't happened yet because the earth is still here. But when, for example, let me see, Second Thessalonians chapter 2, for example, this reference to the great apostasy, when he says, now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken or troubled, shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if, and so he says not to be shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come, right? So there were false teachers there in Thessalonica that were teaching false doctrine about the second coming of Christ. Just like there's a lot of people now teaching false doctrine about the second coming of Christ. But Paul says, you know that the second coming of Christ can't have happened yet because I told you about these things that would happen prior to the second coming of Christ, and it hasn't happened yet. So you know that the second coming can't have already happened because these other things haven't happened yet. So he says, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. So Paul had predicted them, and we see that all through the apostolic writings. Paul predicted it, Peter predicted it, John predicted it. This apostasy that was going to happen, a large scale apostasy. And so he says that the second coming of Christ can't have happened yet because this large scale apostasy hasn't happened yet. From our perspective, looking back, it has. It's called the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. So that large scale apostasy has happened for us, right? But to the Thessalonians that Paul was writing to here, he had prophesied things to them that hadn't happened yet. And so he says the second coming can't have happened yet because these things that I prophesied to you hasn't happened yet. You should know that. That's essentially what he's saying. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. I think that's the papacy, the Roman Catholic papacy, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. The Catholic Pope is referred to as the vicar of God on earth. They believe that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is from his papal seat, that he is speaking by the inspiration of Christ, that he is speaking on behalf of Christ, basically as an apostle. That's false. That and this large scale apostasy that the apostles predicted, you can look through history and exactly what Paul said would happen, what Peter said would happen, what John said would happen. It happened in the uh, development of the Roman Catholic Church. It fits it exactly, fits it like a glove. And so at the time that Paul wrote this, that had not yet been fulfilled. And it wasn't fulfilled before AD 70 either. It wasn't fulfilled until, about the early third century, maybe late second century, early third century, you could say. But really, this man of sin, son of perdition that he's talking about here, the first universally recognized Catholic Pope, Boniface, wasn't until 606, not until the seventh century. And I think you could safely say, when looking at the development of church history, you could safely say that this wide scale apostasy was in its full blown, not really, it wasn't fully developed yet, but it was rolling pretty fast by the early third century, mid third century at the latest. It was wide scale, very easily could be described as the great apostasy that this passage is headed by. This wasn't fulfilled before AD 70. So obviously, the second coming of Christ couldn't have happened at AD 70. That is false teaching about the second coming of Christ. But it has happened. And from that perspective, the second coming of Christ could be anytime. So back to your original comment. Yes, I do believe the book of Revelation is dealing almost primarily with the destruction of Jerusalem. Not entirely, but to a very large degree, dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. But that's not the same thing as to say that the destruction of Jerusalem was the final fulfillment of all New Testament prophecy. It wasn't. Here's an example on the screen of one that wasn't fulfilled before the destruction of Jerusalem.